It's one of the grandest secrets hidden beneath gilded walls, the underground tunnels, silent and suffocating, that served only the unseen. In mansions like the Elms, Clark's Folly, and the Breakers, coal was the lifeblood of lavish warmth. But beneath the surface, it came at a staggering price. Coal wasn't just a source of heat. It was the mechanism of a family's luxury and a servant's torment. Climbing 3 flights of stairs, bearing over 100 tons of coal every year, these workers were trapped in the shadows while the families above lived in pristine comfort. What was the cost of maintaining such wealth? Chapter 1: The Dream That Demanded Everything. The sprawling mansions of the Gilded Age were the symbols of America's new elite, but to build them, the cost was far more than gold. Newport, Rhode Island, the summer of 1891. Along Bellevue Avenue, a transformation was underway that would reshape American architecture forever. The old wooden cottages that had dotted the coastline were giving way to something unprecedented. Stone palaces rose from the earth, each one more extravagant than the last. These were not merely homes. They were declarations of power, monuments to an age when a single family could command wealth that rivaled nations. The names read like a roll call of American aristocracy: Vanderbilt, Astor, Berwind. Each family competed to outdo the others, and to build something that would stand as testament to their dominance. But behind every marble facade, beneath every imported tapestry, there existed a world the architects never showed in their drawings. Richard Morris Hunt stood on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. His plans for the Breakers spread before him. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He understood scale. He understood grandeur. But did he understand the machinery required to bring his vision to life? The plan showed 70 rooms spread across 5 floors. They showed Italian marble and African mahogany. They showed ballrooms that could host 200 guests. What they did not show were the miles of underground passages that would be needed to service this mechanical beast. Because that is what these mansions were: living, breathing organisms that consumed resources at a staggering rate. The Breakers would burn 150 tons of coal each year. Marble House required similar amounts. The Elms, slightly smaller, still demanded over 100 tons annually. This coal had to arrive invisibly. It had to be transported without sound. It had to heat the rooms above without a single flake of soot reaching the Persian rugs or French wallpaper. The solution was elegant in its brutality. Tunnels, secret passages carved beneath the earth, running from the street to the basement furnaces. Coal wagons would arrive at night, tipping their loads through iron grates. From there, men would carry it, bucket by bucket, to feed the insatiable furnaces. The families above would never see this labor. They would never acknowledge it. They would simply enjoy the warmth that rose through hidden vents, maintaining a perfect 72 degrees, even as winter storms battered the coast. Edward Julius Berwind commissioned the Elms in 1898. A coal baron himself, he understood the fuel's value better than most. His fortune was built on extracting anthracite from Pennsylvania mines, selling it to railroads and factories across the nation. Yet even he required the fiction of invisibility. His guests must never see the coal that heated their rooms. The irony was complete. A man who made millions from coal demanded that coal remain hidden in his own home. Horace Trumbauer, the architect of the Elms, created a masterpiece of concealment. The mansion's facade presented perfect symmetry. in classical proportions borrowed from the Château d'Anières near Paris. But beneath this beauty lay a warren of service tunnels, coal chutes, and storage rooms. The plans specified separate staircases for servants, separate hallways, an entire shadow architecture that allowed the house to function while maintaining the illusion of effortless luxury. This was the genius and the cruelty of Gilded Age design. Everything appeared natural. The heat simply existed. The lights simply glowed. Meals simply appeared. But each of these miracles required an army of workers performing tasks that were, by design, invisible. The dream demanded everything. It demanded money, certainly. The breakers cost $7 million to build, equivalent to over $200 million today. But it demanded something else as well. It demanded human beings willing to vanish into the machinery, to sacrifice their health and dignity so that others could live in unmarred beauty. That the question hung in the salt air above Newport. How much does wealth cost those who aren't allowed to enjoy it? The answer was being written in coal dust and sweat in the tunnels beneath Bellevue Avenue. But those who walked the grand halls above would never think to ask. Chapter 2: When Comfort Conceals Suffering. The grand halls and luxurious ballrooms above were nothing more than a mask for the grime and danger lurking below. 6 in the morning. The servants' quarters at the breakers. Thomas Murphy woke in darkness, as he had every morning for the past 3 years. His room measured 8 feet by 10 feet. He shared it with another coal handler. There was no window. The air smelled of damp stone and yesterday's sweat. In 90 minutes, the family would begin to wake. By then, every fireplace on the main floors had to be burning. Every radiator had to be warm. His day had already begun. The coal tunnels at the breakers ran 200 feet from the street entrance to the main furnace room. The ceiling height was 6 feet at most. Thomas was 5 feet 11 inches tall. He spent his working hours in a permanent stoop, shoulders hunched, neck bent. The walls wept moisture. The floor was uneven, cobbled together from broken stone and brick. In winter, ice formed on the walls. In summer, if the heat from the furnaces above turned the tunnels into sweltering chambers where breathing became a conscious effort. The coal arrived every Monday, 4 tons at a time. It came through an iron grate set into the sidewalk on Bellevue Avenue. Passers-by never noticed it. The grate was designed to blend with the pavement, another invisible element in the architecture of concealment. When the coal wagon arrived, usually before dawn, its load tumbled down a chute into a holding room just inside the tunnel entrance. From there, the real work began. Thomas and 3 other men would fill buckets. Each bucket held roughly 40 pounds of coal. The distance from the holding room to the furnace was 200 feet. The furnace room sat 12 feet below ground level, which meant every bucket had to be carried 200 feet through the tunnel, then up a narrow staircase. In a single day, Thomas might make this journey 40 times, 40 trips carrying 40 pounds, 1,600 pounds of coal transported by his body alone. But the coal did not stay in the furnace room. That was merely a way station. The real demand came from above. The breakers had 26 fireplaces on the main floors. Each one required coal to be carried up 3 flights of service stairs. The stairs were narrow, barely 2 feet wide. They spiraled upward in tight turns, designed to fit within the walls where they would not disturb the aesthetic of the main house. Thomas climbed these stairs dozens of times each day. His knees began to ache by age 25. By 30, the pain was constant. The weight was crushing, but the isolation was worse. The tunnels were silent except for the shuffle of feet and the scrape of buckets against stone. The coal handlers worked alone or in pairs, rarely speaking. What was there to say? They all knew the weight, and they all felt the damp. They all saw the same walls closing in. The work created a strange intimacy, a shared suffering that needed no words. Above them, the Vanderbilt family slept in beds imported from France. They bathed in marble tubs fed by hot water that flowed through copper pipes, heated by the very coal Thomas carried. They dressed in rooms where the temperature never varied, where comfort was so absolute it became invisible. They moved through their days, unaware that beneath their feet, men were breaking their bodies to maintain this perfect environment. The contrast was designed. Architect Hunt had planned it this way. The service areas were deliberately separated from the living spaces, not just by walls, but by entire systems of circulation. Servants used different doors, different stairs, different hallways. The two worlds existed in the same structure, but never touched. A guest could spend a week at the breakers and never see a coal handler, never see the soot on their hands, never see the coal dust embedded in their skin. At the Elms, the system was even more refined. Trumbauer had created a service tunnel that ran the entire length of the building, connecting every major room to the basement. Coal, laundry, food, waste. Everything moved through this hidden artery. The tunnel was lit by weak electric bulbs that cast more shadow than light. The temperature in winter dropped below freezing. The servants who worked there wore layers of clothing, but the cold still penetrated. The damp crept into their lungs. Respiratory infections were common. Tuberculosis was a constant threat. The furnaces themselves were monuments to hunger. The boiler at the breakers stood 8 feet tall and 12 feet wide. It consumed coal at a rate of nearly half a ton per day during winter months. Feeding it required constant attention. The fire had to be stoked every 2 hours. The coal had to be shoveled in at precise intervals to maintain steady heat. If the fire grew too hot, pipes could burst. Too cold, and the family would complain. The margin for error was non-existent. The men who tended these furnaces developed a particular relationship with fire. They understood its moods. They could read the color of the flames and know exactly how much coal to add. This was not written in any manual. It was learned through experience, through burned hands and smoke inhalation, and thousands of hours spent in front of the flames. It was knowledge that could not be taught. It could only be suffered into existence. How did such opulence survive the cruelty of its hidden workers? The answer was simple and terrible. The workers were replaceable. If Thomas Murphy collapsed from exhaustion, another man would take his place. If the coal dust destroyed his lungs, someone else would carry the buckets. The system did not depend on any individual. It depended on a constant supply of desperate men willing to trade their health for wages. And in the Gilded Age, such men were always available. The tunnels kept their secrets. They absorbed the coughs and the curses. They witnessed the moments when a man's back gave out, when his knees finally refused to climb another stair. They held these stories in their damp walls and never spoke them to the light. Chapter 3. The Invisible Workforce's Battle. For those who toiled in darkness, the path to the furnace wasn't just a job. It was a journey into exhaustion and despair. James O'Connor arrived at the breakers in the spring of 1895. He was 19 years old. He came from County Cork, part of the great wave of Irish immigration that supplied America's labor force. He could read and write, which made him more educated than many of his peers. He had dreams of saving money, perhaps opening a small shop in Providence. The job at the breakers seemed like an opportunity. Room and board included, steady wages, work for one of the wealthiest families in America. Within a month, he understood his mistake. The coal work was relentless, but it was the invisibility that broke men's spirits. James would spend 12 hours underground, carrying coal, stoking furnaces, clearing ash. Then he would emerge, filthy and exhausted, and climb to his quarters in the attic. Along the way, he might pass members of the Vanderbilt family or their guests. Not once did they look at him. Not once did they acknowledge his existence. He was a ghost, a necessary ghost perhaps, but no more real to them than the pipes in the walls or the wires in the ceiling. This was the true genius of the system. It was not enough to separate the workers physically. They had to be separated psychologically as well. The servants were trained to move silently, to keep their eyes down, to vanish if a family member approached. They learned to become invisible even when standing in plain sight. This erasure was enforced through strict rules. Speaking unless spoken to was forbidden. Making eye contact was forbidden. Existing in any way that might disturb the aesthetic perfection of the house was forbidden. The wages reflected this invisibility. James earned $30 per month. This sounds modest until compared to the cost of the house itself. The breakers burned coal worth roughly $100 per month during winter. The mansion's monthly operating costs, including all servant wages, food, maintenance, and utilities, totaled around $800. Meanwhile, Cornelius Vanderbilt II's annual income from his railroad holdings exceeded $10 million. The mathematical disparity was staggering. James would have to work for over 27,000 years to earn what Vanderbilt made in a single year. But mathematics could not capture the physical toll. James's hands became calloused, then scarred. The coal dust worked its way under his skin, creating permanent black lines around his fingernails and in the creases of his palms. He developed a persistent cough. At night, he would wake gasping, feeling as though the tunnel walls were pressing in on his chest. The other coal handlers recognized these symptoms. They had experienced them too. Some had been doing this work for 10 years. Their bodies showed the cost. Bent spines, swollen knees, fingers that could no longer straighten. The women in service faced different but equally grinding demands. Mary Sullivan worked in the kitchen at the Elms. Her day began at 4:30 in the morning. She was responsible for lighting the kitchen stoves, which required carrying coal from the basement up 2 flights of service stairs. The stoves had to be hot by 6 when the cook arrived to begin breakfast preparations. Mary's hands were permanently rough from scrubbing pots with lye soap. Her feet ached from standing on stone floors for 16 hours a day. She earned $20 per month, 2/3 of what the male coal handlers made. The hierarchy among servants was rigid. At the top were the butler and housekeeper, who earned $60 to $70 monthly and enjoyed relative autonomy. Below them came specialized workers like the chef, the lady's maid, the valet. At the bottom, far below, were the coal handlers, scullery maids, and laundresses. These were the true invisibles. They touched the dirtiest parts of the house's machinery. They were expendable. The emotional toll manifested in different ways. Some workers became numb, moving through their days in a fog of exhaustion. Others grew angry, nurturing a resentment that had no outlet. James fell into the latter category. He began to notice details that fed his rage, the waste especially. He would watch servants scrape half-eaten meals into garbage bins while he survived on kitchen leftovers and bread. He would see coal scattered on the tunnel floor, wasted, worth more than his daily wage. He would pass through rooms that were heated despite being unused, coal burning to warm empty space. The breakers had 70 rooms. On any given day, perhaps 20 were occupied. But all of them had to be heated. All of them had to be maintained at the same perfect temperature. The family might decide on a whim to use the billiard room or the library. Everything had to be ready. So coal burned in empty rooms while James climbed the service stairs, carrying fuel for fires no one would see. The isolation compounded the struggle. The workers came from different countries, spoke different languages: Irish, Italian, German, Polish. They competed for the same limited positions. They were taught not to organize, not to complain, not to question. The system pitted them against each other. If James asked for better conditions, 10 men waited to replace him. The employers knew this. They used it ruthlessly. There were small rebellions. A coal handler might work slowly, stretching a task across hours instead of minutes. A maid might accidentally break an expensive vase. These acts of resistance were petty but meaningful. They were assertions of agency in a world designed to strip workers of all power. They were dangerous too. Dismissal meant losing not just wages, but also housing. A fired servant faced immediate homelessness. The tunnels absorbed these tensions. They became spaces of whispered conversations, of shared cigarettes during brief breaks, of confessions that could never be spoken above ground. In the darkness, the workers were honest. They spoke of their pain. They spoke of their dreams of escape. They spoke of the growing sense that this could not continue forever. How long could they continue to bear this unseen burden? James did not know. But lying in his narrow bed at night, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, he felt something shifting. A crack in the foundation. A sense that the weight he carried was not sustainable. Something would have to give. He did not know what. He did not know when. But he felt it coming, inevitable as the dawn. Chapter 4: The Furnace of Greed. Beneath the wealth, the heat, and the beauty, if there was a fire burning, one that consumed more than just coal. The year 1896 brought unprecedented wealth to America's industrial elite. The economy was booming. Railroads connected the coasts. Steel production reached new heights. The stock market climbed steadily. And in Newport, the building continued. More mansions, larger mansions, each one trying to surpass its neighbors in magnificence and excess. Cornelius Vanderbilt II stood in the completed grand salon of the breakers, surveying his achievement. The room rose 3 stories high. Its walls were covered in platinum leaf. The ceiling featured a massive painted mural depicting Aurora riding her chariot across the sky. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, each one containing over 100 individual pieces cut and polished in France. The room could accommodate 300 guests. It had cost $200,000 to complete, more than most Americans would earn in 10 lifetimes. But Vanderbilt was not satisfied. Satisfaction was impossible in the world he inhabited. His brother William had built Marble House, spending $11 million on its construction. The Astors were planning something even larger. The competition was not about comfort. It had nothing to do with need. It was about dominance, about creating something so extravagant that it could not be matched, about asserting superiority through stone and gold and imported craftsmanship. This appetite had consequences that rippled downward through every level of society. The demand for coal increased with every new mansion. The breakers alone required 150 tons annually. Marble House used nearly the same amount. The Elms demanded 120 tons. Rosecliff, Rough Point, Belcourt Castle. Each estate consumed fuel at rates that would have powered entire towns. Newport's coal imports increased by 400% between 1890 and 1900. The harbor was constantly crowded with coal barges. The coal came from Pennsylvania, from the anthracite fields controlled by men like Edward Berwind. The mines went deep into the earth, sometimes reaching depths of over 1,000 feet. The miners worked in darkness, breathing air thick with coal dust, facing constant risk of cave-ins and explosions. They earned roughly $15 per week for this dangerous labor. Many died young. Black lung disease was so common it was considered an occupational hazard, unavoidable. The coal traveled by rail from Pennsylvania to the ports of New York and Boston. From there, it was loaded onto barges and shipped to Newport. Each step of this journey involved manual labor. Men shoveling coal into rail cars, men transferring it to barges, men unloading it at the docks, and finally, men like James O'Connor carrying it through underground tunnels to feed the insatiable furnaces. The entire system was built on broken backs and destroyed lungs. The economics were deliberately obscured. The Vanderbilts did not think about the true cost of their coal. They paid their bills, certainly, but they never calculated the human price. They never stood in a Pennsylvania mine and watched a 12-year-old boy push a coal cart through passages too low for a grown man to navigate. They never saw the widows of miners killed in explosions. They never confronted the fact that their comfort was purchased with other people's suffering. This willful ignorance was essential to the system's function. If the wealthy had to acknowledge the full cost of their lifestyle, the moral burden might become unbearable. So the architecture of concealment extended beyond the physical tunnels. It became psychological. The servants were invisible. The miners were invisible. The entire apparatus of labor that maintained the Gilded Age aristocracy was carefully hidden from view. At the Elms, Edward Berwind entertained guests with stories of his coal empire. He spoke of tonnage and markets and profit margins. He described the technical challenges of deep mining, the engineering required to ventilate the shafts and pump out water. But he never mentioned the men who did the actual work. They existed in his accounting books as line items. Labor costs, overhead, in numbers to be minimized for maximum profit. The furnaces at these mansions operated on a principle of constant consumption. The boilers could not be allowed to go cold. Reheating them took too much time and fuel, so they burned day and night, regardless of whether anyone was home. During the summer, when the families departed for Europe or the Adirondacks, a skeleton crew remained behind. The houses were kept at reduced temperatures, but the furnaces still burned. Coal was still carried through the tunnels. The machinery could not stop. James O'Connor calculated once that in his 3 years at the breakers, he had personally carried over 200 tons of coal. 200 tons. 400,000 pounds. He had carried this weight bucket by bucket, step by step, through damp tunnels and up narrow staircases. His body bore the evidence. At 22 years old, he moved like a man of 50. His knees cracked when he stood. His shoulders were permanently rounded from years of stooping in the low tunnels. His lungs rattled with every breath. The other servants noticed these changes in each other. They saw friends and co-workers deteriorate. They attended funerals of men who died far too young. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, heart failure. The official causes of death rarely mentioned coal dust or exhaustion, but everyone knew the work was killing them. Slowly, certainly, but no less deadly for its gradual pace. And the mansion owners faced no such consequences. Cornelius Vanderbilt II suffered a stroke in 1896 at age 53. His doctors attributed it to stress and overwork. Perhaps that was true. Running a railroad empire carried its own pressures. But he recovered in comfort, surrounded by the best medical care money could buy. He convalesced in his mansion, kept warm by coal he never saw, tended by servants he barely acknowledged. When he died in 1900 at age 57, and he left an estate worth over $70 million. His children would never work a day in their lives if they chose not to. The moral calculus of the Gilded Age was brutally simple. Some lives mattered more than others. Some comfort was worth any price. Some people existed to serve, and some existed to be served. These truths were never stated explicitly. They were embedded in the architecture, in the separate stairs and hidden tunnels, in the wages that kept workers perpetually dependent, and in the social structures that prevented any meaningful change. Was the cost of this luxury truly worth the suffering it created? The question assumed that the wealthy considered it a cost at all. To them, this was simply how the world worked. Servants had always existed. Laborers had always toiled. The fact that their toil occurred in underground tunnels rather than open fields did not change its fundamental nature. The mansion was a machine. The workers were components. When a component wore out, it was replaced. But machines break down. Systems fail. And in the darkness beneath the breakers, among men pushed past their limits, something was beginning to stir. A recognition that the weight they carried was not inevitable. That the suffering they endured was not natural. That the mansion, for all its beauty, was built on a foundation of exploitation that could not stand forever. Chapter 5. The Shadows of Industry. As coal consumption surged, so did the isolation and fear that coal transporters faced in their subterranean world. The tunnels had a smell. It was the first thing new workers noticed, and the last thing they forgot. Coal dust mixed with damp stone, mildew, and the acrid tang of furnace smoke that seeped backward through the ventilation system. The smell clung to clothing, to skin, to hair. No amount of washing could fully remove it. The coal handlers became marked by it, unidentifiable even when they tried to blend with the world above. Winter of 1897 brought the coldest temperatures Newport had seen in decades. The harbor froze solid for the first time in 50 years. Snow fell in relentless waves, piling 6 feet deep in some areas. And the mansions burned hotter. The breakers increased its coal consumption to nearly a ton per day. The Elms matched this rate. Marble House exceeded it. The demand was crushing. James O'Connor worked 16-hour days that winter. He woke at 4 in the morning and did not finish until after 8 at night. His hands bled from hauling buckets in freezing temperatures. The metal handles became so cold they burned skin on contact. He wrapped them in cloth, but the moisture from his hands froze the cloth to the metal. Every trip through the tunnel was agony. The psychological impact was worse than the physical. The tunnels played tricks on the mind. In the weak light of flickering gas lamps, shadows moved in ways that made no sense. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling pressed down. Some workers reported hearing voices in the distance, conversations that fell silent as they approached. Others swore they felt presences in the darkness, invisible watchers that followed them through the passages. These were not ghosts. They were the products of exhaustion and isolation and oxygen deprivation. The ventilation in the tunnels was poor. The air was thick with coal dust and furnace smoke. Men working 12 to 16-hour shifts in these conditions experienced hallucinations. They stumbled. They lost time. They emerged from the tunnels unable to account for hours of their day. The mansion owners never descended into these spaces. They had no reason to. The tunnels existed to spare them any contact with the dirty necessities of their lifestyle. But their ignorance did not absolve them. That they knew the coal had to come from somewhere. They knew men had to carry it. They simply chose not to think about the details. This willful blindness was itself a kind of cruelty. The isolation bred strange bonds among the workers. Men who barely spoke the same language learned to communicate through gesture and expression. They developed a silent vocabulary of suffering. A particular way of rubbing the lower back meant the pain was getting worse. A certain type of cough signaled the coal dust was winning. They took care of each other in small ways, sharing food, covering for a colleague too sick to work. These acts of kindness were tiny rebellions against a system designed to make them compete rather than cooperate. At the Elms, the tunnel system was particularly elaborate. It ran not just to the street, but also to several outbuildings. The coal traveled underground to the carriage house, to the greenhouse, to the power plant that generated electricity for the mansion. The total length of tunnels exceeded 400 feet. The coal handlers walked miles each day, shuffling through passages that never saw daylight. One of these handlers was Giuseppe Moretti. He had come from Sicily in 1895, fleeing poverty and seeking opportunity. He found work at the Elms through a cousin who already labored there. Giuseppe spoke almost no English. He communicated through nods and gestures, but he understood the weight of the coal buckets. He understood the burn in his muscles. He understood the look in other workers' eyes that said they were all trapped in the same darkness. Giuseppe developed a fear of the tunnels that bordered on panic. He would stand at the entrance, gathering courage before descending. His hands would shake, his breathing would quicken, but he descended anyway. He had no choice. The alternative was starvation. So each morning, he forced himself into the passages, forced himself to carry the coal, forced himself to survive another day. The fear was not irrational. The tunnels were dangerous. Cave-ins were rare, but not unknown. The walls were brick and stone, held together with aging mortar. Water damage weakened structures. Heavy snowfall above added weight and pressure. In the winter of 1898, a section of tunnel at Rough Point collapsed. 2 workers were inside. They survived but were trapped for 6 hours before rescue. Both suffered broken bones. Neither received compensation beyond their regular wages. This incident barely registered in the consciousness of the mansion owners. It was not discussed at dinner parties. It did not appear in the society pages. It was simply another cost of doing business, handled by staff and forgotten. The workers, however, did not forget. The collapse confirmed their deepest fears. The tunnels could kill them. The mansion did not care. The consumption patterns of coal revealed the priorities of the Gilded Age with brutal clarity. The breakers spent more on coal in a single winter than it paid its entire coal handling staff for a year. The coal itself was valued more highly than the men who carried it. This was not an accident of accounting. It was a deliberate expression of what mattered and what did not. Edward Berwind understood coal's value intimately. His Berwind White Coal Mining Company controlled vast anthracite deposits in Pennsylvania. He had made his fortune by recognizing coal as the fuel of industrial America. Railroads needed it, factories needed it, cities needed it, and now the wealthy needed it to heat their extravagant homes. Berwind supplied all these markets. His annual income exceeded $2 million. Yet the miners who extracted his coal earned roughly $800 per year. The men who transported it in his own mansion earned $360 annually. The disparity was astronomical. Berwind's daily income exceeded what his coal handlers made in a year. This fact was well known, but never discussed. It was the unspoken foundation of the entire system. Can a society that thrives on such dark labor continue without repercussions? The question hung in the coal dust that filled the tunnels. It echoed in the coughs of men whose lungs were slowly failing. It lived in the bent backs and swollen joints of workers aged beyond their years. The repercussions were already occurring. They were simply invisible to those who benefited from the system. The tunnels witnessed everything. They absorbed the pain and fear and anger of countless workers. They held these emotions in their damp walls, in their shadowed corners, in the endless stretches of darkness that connected the world above to the world below. And in that darkness, something was growing. Not a physical presence, but an awareness, a recognition among the workers that they were not alone, that their suffering was shared, that the weight they carried was too heavy for any individual, but might be borne collectively. The winter passed, spring came. The coal demand decreased slightly, but the tunnels remained, the workers remained, and the question remained. How much longer could this continue? How many more tons could be carried before something broke? The answer was approaching, is inevitable as the next load of coal. Chapter 6, The Turning Point. While the owners enjoyed lavish evenings above, the cracks beneath them were widening, physically and morally. August 1899, the height of the Newport social season. The breakers hosted a ball that would become legendary even by Gilded Age standards. 400 guests, an orchestra imported from New York, champagne flowing from ice sculptures carved to resemble swans. The menu featured 12 courses prepared by a chef brought from Paris specifically for the event. The cost exceeded $50,000, equivalent to over $1.5 million today. In the tunnels below, James O'Connor carried coal. The August heat made the underground passages nearly unbearable. The temperature exceeded 90 degrees. The humidity was suffocating. But the mansion's cooling system required constant fuel. Ice boxes needed replenishing. Fans needed power. The comfort of the guests above depended on the suffering of the workers below. James collapsed that night. His body simply gave out. He was carrying a bucket of coal up the service stairs when his vision blurred and his legs buckled. He tumbled backward, the coal scattering across the steps. Another worker found him unconscious. Coal dust caked around his mouth and nose. They carried him to his room and let him rest. There was no doctor. There was no compensation. The next morning, so he was expected back at work. He could not do it. For the first time in 4 years, James refused. He stayed in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house waking around him. He expected to be fired. He expected to be thrown out. Instead, something unexpected happened. The other coal handlers covered for him. They split his work among themselves, carrying extra loads, working faster to maintain the schedule. The mansion above noticed nothing. The system continued without him. This small act of solidarity marked a shift. The workers had always helped each other in minor ways. But this was different. This was collective action, however limited. It was a recognition that they had power, even if only the power to keep each other alive. The head butler discovered the arrangement within 2 days. He summoned the coal handlers to his office. He stood behind his desk, looking down at them with barely concealed contempt. These were the lowest servants, the dirtiest workers. They existed at his pleasure. He told them that if they did not return to normal operations immediately, all of them would be dismissed. Not just James. All of them. They returned to work, but something had changed. They had glimpsed possibility. They had seen that the mansion needed them more than they had realized. The work could not function without their cooperation. This knowledge was dangerous. It bred questions. What else might be possible? What other demands might be made? The physical structure of the tunnels was deteriorating as well. Years of moisture and temperature fluctuations had weakened the mortar. Bricks were loose in several sections. Water pooled in low areas, creating breeding grounds for mold and bacteria. The mansion's owners were aware of these issues. Maintenance reports documented the problems, but repairs were delayed. The cost of fixing the tunnels was deemed unnecessary. They still functioned. The coal still reached the furnaces. That was sufficient. At the Elms, conditions were even worse. The tunnel system there had been built quickly, with less attention to structural integrity. By 1899, portions of the ceiling were actively crumbling. Giuseppe Moretti was struck by falling brick in September. The injury was minor, a cut above his eye that bled profusely but healed quickly. But the psychological impact was severe. He became convinced the tunnels would collapse and kill him. His fear turned to obsession. He began refusing to enter certain sections. This slowed the work, created bottlenecks, angered the supervisors. Edward Berwind was informed of the situation. His response was characteristic. Fire the problematic worker and hire a replacement. There were always more men desperate for work. The tunnels did not need to be safe. They needed to be functional. Giuseppe was dismissed in October. He found work at the docks, loading cargo for half the wages he had earned at the Elms. He never set foot in an underground passage again. But the fear Giuseppe had expressed was spreading. Other workers began to notice the deterioration. They saw the cracks widening. They felt the moisture weakening the structure. They understood that they were working in spaces that might collapse at any moment. And they understood that their employers did not care. Their safety was not a priority. Their lives were not valuable enough to warrant preventive maintenance. This realization was radicalizing. The workers had accepted poverty. They had accepted exhaustion. They had even accepted invisibility. But being told explicitly that their lives did not matter enough to fix a crumbling wall was different. It was an insult that cut deeper than any wage dispute. The newspapers of the time carried occasional stories about servant unrest in other cities. In New York, domestic workers were beginning to organize. In Boston, a strike at a private club had forced owners to improve conditions. These stories filtered down to the workers in Newport. They sparked conversations. Could the same thing happen here? Could the invisible workforce make itself visible? The obstacles were immense. The Newport mansions operated in isolation from each other. Workers at the breakers did not interact with workers at the Elms or Marble House. There was no natural way to communicate across properties. The seasonal nature of the work complicated matters further. Many servants were employed only for the summer season, then dismissed in autumn when the families departed. Building solidarity required continuity, and continuity was deliberately prevented by the employment structure. Yet, the conversations continued, in the workers' quarters after hours, on the rare days off when servants from different households might encounter each other in town. The discussions were cautious, whispered. No one wanted to be identified as a troublemaker. But the ideas circulated: better wages, shorter hours, safe working conditions, basic recognition of their humanity. The mansion owners remained oblivious. They planned their next seasons, their next parties, their next acquisitions. Cornelius Vanderbilt II purchased additional art for the breakers, in spending $30,000 on paintings that would hang in rooms he visited perhaps twice a year. The disconnect between this expenditure and the refusal to repair the workers' tunnels was absolute. It never occurred to him that there might be a moral relationship between these decisions. How long could this system sustain itself before it came crashing down? The cracks were no longer just in the tunnel walls. They ran through the entire structure of Gilded Age society. The wealth gap was widening. The exploitation was intensifying. The pretense of mutual benefit was becoming harder to maintain. Even the servants who had accepted their lot were beginning to question whether their suffering was truly necessary. The house was no longer just a place of luxury. It had become a symbol of the cost of maintaining such grandeur. Every gold leaf detail, every marble column, every crystal chandelier, all of it rested on a foundation of human suffering that the owners refused to acknowledge. The question was not whether this could continue. The question was what would happen when it could no longer be ignored. Chapter 7. The Collapse of Silence. Silence was the servants' only ally, but even that was beginning to fail them. The winter of 1900 tested the limits of what human bodies could endure. The breakers burned coal at unprecedented rates. January alone consumed over 20 tons. The coal handlers worked in shifts that overlapped and extended, some men laboring 18 hours straight to meet the demand. Sleep became a luxury. Food was consumed standing, in gulps between trips through the tunnels. The body's protests were ignored because there was no alternative. James O'Connor's cough had worsened to the point where he could no longer hide it. Every breath rattled in his chest. He coughed up black phlegm, the unmistakable sign that the coal dust had penetrated deep into his lungs. The other workers recognized the symptoms. They had seen this before. They knew where it led, but they said nothing. What could they say? The work would not stop. The furnaces would not relent. In February, a new development changed everything. A reporter from the Newport Daily News began investigating working conditions in the mansions. His name was Samuel Hartley. He was young, ambitious, and possessed of that dangerous combination of idealism and access to a printing press. He had heard rumors of the tunnels, of the invisible labor force, of the conditions that the mansion owners worked so hard to conceal. Hartley approached workers during their rare moments off property. He offered money for their stories. Most refused. The risk was too great. But a few talked. They described the tunnels, the weight, the dust, the hours, the wages. Hartley took notes. He verified details. He built a story that would expose what the Gilded Age elite most wanted to keep hidden. The article appeared in March 1900. The headline read, "Beneath the Gilded Surface, the Hidden Cost of Newport Luxury." It described in detail the working conditions at several mansions, including the Breakers and the Elms. It named no specific workers, but provided enough information that the owners could likely identify their sources. It was explosive. The reaction was swift and divided. The working-class population of Newport read the article with grim satisfaction. Here, finally, was public acknowledgement of what they had always known. The wealthy were horrified, not by the conditions described, but by the fact that they had been described at all. The violation was not the suffering, but its exposure. Edward Berwin demanded to know which of his servants had talked to the press. He called a meeting of his entire household staff. He stood before them, his face red with anger, and announced that any worker found to have cooperated with the newspaper would be immediately terminated without references. References were crucial. Without them, finding new employment was nearly impossible. The threat was clear and effective. But the damage was done. The article had made the invisible visible. Other newspapers picked up the story. Reform-minded groups in Boston and New York began asking questions. Social reformers visited Newport, seeking to document the conditions. The servants themselves began to realize they were not entirely powerless. Their stories had value. Their testimony could create consequences. A small group of workers at the Breakers began meeting in secret. They gathered in a storage room near the tunnels during the brief overlap between shifts when supervisors were least likely to notice their absence. There were 6 of them at first: James O'Connor, Thomas Murphy, Michael Flynn, Patrick Donnelly, Antonio Russo, Henrik Nilsson. Different backgrounds, different languages, united by exhaustion and anger. They talked about organizing, about making demands, better wages certainly, but also basic safety measures, ventilation in the tunnels, structural repairs, shorter shifts, the right to see a doctor when injured. These were not radical demands. They were requests for basic human dignity. But in the context of Gilded Age labor relations, they were revolutionary. The risk of organizing was enormous. Labor unions were viewed as dangerous by the wealthy elite. Strikes were broken by hired thugs and complicit police forces. Workers who attempted to organize were blacklisted. Their names circulated among employers to ensure they never worked again. The Newport mansion owners had even more leverage than typical employers. They controlled not just jobs, but housing. Dismissed workers faced immediate homelessness. Despite these dangers, the organizing continued. Word spread carefully, up through trusted channels. By April, the group had grown to 15 workers from the Breakers alone. Similar groups were forming at other mansions. The workers communicated through notes left in agreed-upon locations. They developed a rudimentary network, the first steps toward collective action. The mansion owners were not oblivious to this activity. Information leaked. Sympathetic servants reported the meetings to their employers, hoping to gain favor or avoid being implicated. The owners conferred among themselves. They agreed on a coordinated response. Anyone suspected of organizing would be fired. New workers would be brought in from Boston and New York to replace troublemakers. The rebellion would be crushed before it could take root. In May, the firings began. James O'Connor was dismissed without explanation. So were Thomas Murphy and 6 others. They were given 1 day to collect their belongings and leave the property. No severance, no references, just expulsion. The message to the remaining workers was unmistakable. This is what happens when you step out of line. But the firings backfired in ways the owners had not anticipated. The dismissed workers had nothing left to lose. They went directly to the newspapers. They gave detailed interviews describing their working conditions, naming specific mansions, providing evidence that could not be easily dismissed. Samuel Hartley wrote a series of follow-up articles that ran for 2 weeks. Yet each one brought new revelations: the coal consumption rates, the wage disparities, the refusal to make basic safety repairs. The public reaction was mixed but significant. Working-class readers were outraged. Middle-class reformers began calling for investigations. But the wealthy class circled their wagons. They denounced the articles as exaggerations. They claimed the workers were lazy and ungrateful. They insisted that their households were models of benevolent employment. The battle lines were drawn between competing narratives of reality. The tunnels themselves became symbols in this conflict. For the workers, they represented oppression and exploitation. For the owners, they represented necessary infrastructure that enabled comfort. The fact that human beings had to crawl through these spaces, carrying crushing weights in dangerous conditions, was framed differently depending on one's perspective. The workers saw injustice. The owners saw the natural order. A secret built on the sweat and blood of the unseen truly remain concealed forever. The events of 1900 suggested it could not. Once exposed, the hidden world of the servants could not be easily hidden again. The silence had been broken. The invisible had been made visible. What happened next would determine whether this visibility led to change or merely to better concealment. The summer season approached. The mansions prepared for their annual influx of guests. But beneath the preparations, tension simmered. The workers who remained were angry about the firings. The owners were determined to assert control. The journalists continued to investigate. And in the tunnels beneath the breakers and the Elms and a dozen other estates, coal was still being carried by men whose bodies were breaking and whose patience was exhausted. Chapter 8. The Breakpoint. Coal, the very fuel that kept the flames of wealth burning, was now a symbol of the suffocating oppression it had caused. Summer 1900 brought changes to Newport that went beyond the usual seasonal rhythms. The newspaper articles had created an atmosphere of scrutiny that made the mansion owners uncomfortable. They felt watched, judged. The perfect facade they had worked so hard to maintain was cracking, and they blamed the workers for the damage. The replacement workers brought in after the May firings were poorly trained, and they did not know the tunnel systems. They did not understand the furnace's temperaments. Coal deliveries were mishandled. Fires burned too hot or too cold. The smooth operation that had characterized these households for years began to falter. The owners noticed. Their comfort was affected, and they were not pleased. At the breakers, a new coal handler named William McCarthy made a critical error in June. He fed the main boiler too much coal too quickly. The pressure built rapidly. The safety valve stuck. The boiler came dangerously close to exploding. If it had, the destruction would have been catastrophic. The furnace room would have been destroyed. Workers would have died. Portions of the mansion might have been damaged. But luck and a quick-thinking engineer prevented disaster. The pressure was released manually. The crisis averted. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was informed of the incident, but his reaction revealed the essential conflict at the heart of the Gilded Age labor system. He was furious about the danger to his property. The possibility that his mansion might have been damaged enraged him, but he expressed no concern for the workers who would have been killed in an explosion. They were replaceable. The mansion was not. This incident crystallized something for the remaining workers. They saw clearly that their lives had no value to their employers, not as human beings, not even as economic assets. They were simply mechanisms, as replaceable as coal buckets or shovels. This knowledge was liberating in its brutality. It removed any illusions about mutual obligation or benevolent paternalism. The relationship was purely transactional, and if it was purely transactional, then the workers owed nothing beyond the minimum required to keep their positions. A slow work campaign began, not a strike, which would have been immediately crushed, but a collective decision to work at the pace the contracts technically required rather than the accelerated pace that had become expected. Coal deliveries slowed. Furnace tending became more methodical. The workers followed the rules precisely, which paradoxically reduced efficiency. The mansion still functioned, but the margin of comfort decreased. The owners noticed. Rooms were cooler. Hot water took longer to heat. The seamless luxury they had come to expect became slightly less seamless. They complained to their staff supervisors. The supervisors threatened the workers. The workers shrugged and pointed to their contract requirements. They were doing exactly what was specified. If more was expected, perhaps wages should be increased to reflect that. This was the breakpoint. The moment when the unspoken contract between servant and master was explicitly challenged. For years, workers had done far more than required because they feared dismissal. Now, collectively, they were demonstrating that this fear could be overcome. If all workers reduced their pace together, the owners could not fire everyone. The system required workers more than workers required any specific position. Edward Berwind faced this reality in July. His household staff informed him that repairs to the Elms tunnel system would require a temporary shutdown of certain sections. Coal would need to be carried longer distances. More workers would be needed, or existing workers would need to work longer hours at increased pay. Berwind refused both options. He insisted the current staff could manage. He was wrong. The temperature in the Elms became inconsistent. Some rooms were cold, others were too warm. Guests complained. Berwind's wife was embarrassed by the decline in standards. Still, Berwind would not budge. To accept the workers' implicit demands would be to acknowledge their power. He would rather endure discomfort than grant that acknowledgement. By August, the situation had become untenable at multiple estates. The slow work campaign had spread. Workers at Marble House, Rosecliff, and Belcourt Castle had joined. The Newport Mansion owners held emergency meetings. They discussed bringing in strikebreakers. They discussed mass firings and complete staff replacements. But the logistics were daunting. The summer season was at its peak. They needed functioning households immediately. Into this standoff stepped an unlikely mediator. Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, a prominent socialite known for her progressive views, suggested a compromise. She proposed that the owners agree to basic safety improvements and modest wage increases in exchange for the workers returning to normal productivity. Most owners rejected this outright, but a few, facing particularly acute staffing problems, agreed to negotiate. The negotiations were tense and brief. The workers demanded 15% wage increases, reduced maximum shift lengths, and immediate repairs to dangerous tunnel sections. The owners offered 5% increases, no commitment on shift lengths, and vague promises about eventual repairs. After 3 days of back and forth, a compromise emerged: 10% wage increases, maximum shifts of 14 hours except in emergencies, safety inspections of tunnel systems with repairs scheduled within 6 months. Not all mansions agreed to these terms. The Breakers and Marble House refused any negotiations. But enough estates accepted the compromise that the slow work campaign ended. The workers had won something. Not everything they wanted, not even most of what they needed, but they had demonstrated collective power and extracted concessions. It was unprecedented in Newport's history. The emotional toll of this conflict was severe on both sides. The workers felt the weight of their partial victory. They had risked everything and gained relatively little. Some of the most vocal organizers had been fired and blacklisted. Their sacrifice enabled the compromise, but they personally gained nothing. This bred resentment and guilt among those who kept their positions. The owners felt betrayed and threatened. They had always believed their wealth entitled them to unquestioned authority over their households. The fact that servants could organize and force concessions shook their worldview. Some responded with petty cruelty, finding excuses to fire workers who had participated in the slowdown. Others retreated into rigid formality, creating even greater distance between themselves and their staff. The tunnels, throughout all this, remained unchanged in their essential nature. They were still dark, still damp, still dangerous. The promised repairs happened slowly, if at all. The coal still needed carrying. The furnaces still needed feeding. The fundamental relationship between wealth and labor remained intact. But something had shifted. The workers now knew they could fight. The owners now knew they could lose. Can anyone survive a system that burns both the fuel and the souls of those who feed it? The events of 1900 suggested that survival required transformation. The system as it existed was unsustainable. Either it would evolve toward greater equity, or it would collapse under the weight of its contradictions. The mansion owners preferred to believe that the crisis was over, that a few concessions would restore stability. The workers understood that this was only the beginning. Chapter 9. The Final Rebellion. A single spark could set the mansion alight, but it was a series of small rebellions that ultimately brought the house to its knees. The compromise of 1900 held through the autumn. Workers received their modest raises. Some tunnel repairs were made, though not as many as promised. The daily routines continued, but beneath the surface, resentment festered on both sides. The owners felt they had been coerced. The workers felt they had been shortchanged. Neither side trusted the other. Winter arrived with unusual mildness. The coal demands were lower than typical for the season. This created a problem the owners had not anticipated. With less coal needed, fewer workers were required. The estates began laying off staff, using the reduced workload as justification. But the workers saw this as retaliation for the summer's organizing. They were probably right. The layoffs targeted precisely those who had been most vocal during the slowdown. In January 1901, a coal shortage hit the Northeast. A strike in Pennsylvania closed several major mines. Coal shipments to Newport slowed dramatically. Prices spiked. The mansions that had always taken fuel for granted suddenly faced the possibility of running out. The remaining workers saw an opportunity. At the Elms, the coal handlers made an audacious demand. They wanted double wages for the duration of the shortage. Their reasoning was simple. The coal was more valuable now, and they were the ones transporting it. The value of their labor had increased correspondingly. Edward Berwind exploded in rage. He threatened to fire the entire coal handling staff. They called his bluff. They knew he could not replace them quickly enough, not with coal already in short supply and temperatures dropping. Berwind capitulated. He agreed to double wages temporarily, but he also began planning his revenge. He contacted coal suppliers in Virginia, seeking alternative sources. He commissioned engineers to design more efficient heating systems that would reduce coal dependence. He was determined that his household would never again be held hostage by servants. The breakers faced a similar situation, but responded differently. Cornelius Vanderbilt II refused all demands. When his coal handlers threatened to walk out, he shut down most of the mansion. He moved his family to their New York residence. Only a skeleton crew remained in Newport, maintaining basic operations. The message was clear. He would rather abandon the property than negotiate with servants. This response terrified the workers at other estates. If Vanderbilt could simply leave, what leverage did they really have? The wealthy were mobile in ways servants could never be. They had multiple properties. They could winter in the city or travel to Europe. The mansions were not essential to their survival, but steady wages were essential to the workers. The power balance was not as favorable as it had briefly seemed. By February, the Pennsylvania strike ended. Coal shipments resumed. Prices dropped back toward normal levels. The crisis passed, and with it, the workers' temporary leverage evaporated. The owners who had agreed to increased wages immediately rescinded them. They cited the emergency conditions as justification for temporary measures. Now that conditions were normal, so were wages. The workers who had believed they were winning realized they had only delayed the inevitable. The system was too entrenched, the wealth disparity too vast, the social structures too rigid. A few men carrying coal buckets could not overturn the entire Gilded Age order. The realization was devastating. Some workers gave up. They accepted their lot, returned to their routines, tried to forget the brief moment when change seemed possible. Others left Newport entirely, seeking different work in different cities where their organizing efforts might not be known. A few remained committed to resistance, but their numbers were small and their options limited. The tunnels absorbed these defeats as they had absorbed everything else. They witnessed men breaking down in despair. They heard the conversations where workers admitted they had no path forward. They contained the tears shed by those who had hoped and lost. The darkness did not judge. It simply held these moments and added them to its collection of sorrows. At the breakers, an act of sabotage occurred in March. Someone, never identified, and dumped contaminated coal into the main furnace. The impurities created toxic smoke that spread through the ventilation system into the mansion's living areas. The Vanderbilts were not in residence, but several servants became ill. The damage to furnishings and artwork was significant. The culprit was never caught, though several workers were fired on suspicion. This incident marked the culmination of the cycle of oppression and resistance. The workers had tried organizing, and they had tried negotiation. They had tried leveraging market conditions. All had failed to create lasting change. Now some were turning to sabotage, to destruction, to making the owners feel pain even if it came at the workers' own expense. This was not strategy. This was desperation. The mansion owners responded by increasing security and surveillance. They hired guards to patrol the properties at night. They installed locks on tunnel entrances. They created systems of mutual reporting among servants, encouraging them to inform on each other. The household became a police state in miniature. Every movement watched, every word potentially reported. The social fabric that had allowed any cooperation among workers was deliberately shredded. Trust became impossible. The owners had learned their lesson. They would never again allow servants to organize. They would prevent solidarity before it could form. They would maintain control not through benevolence, but through fear and division. Yet even as they tightened their grip, the owners were losing something essential. The mansions had always depended on a degree of willing cooperation from servants. Workers who took pride in their craft, who wanted the household to run smoothly, who felt some loyalty to the institution, if not the individuals. That goodwill was gone. Now there was only compliance extracted through threat. The work still got done, but the spirit was different. The final rebellion was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a slow withdrawal of emotional investment. The workers stopped caring about excellence. They performed their duties adequately, but without enthusiasm. They followed rules precisely, but offered no initiative. They were present in body, but absent in spirit. This was a form of resistance the owners could not directly address because it violated no explicit rule. The mansions continued to function. The coal was still carried. The furnaces were still fed. The luxury continued. But something vital had been lost. The illusion that this was a harmonious system, that servants were grateful for the opportunity to serve, that wealth and labor existed in natural partnership. That fiction could no longer be maintained. Can the mansion and the world it represents survive the cracks it has created? The answer depended on how one defined survival. The physical structures remained standing. The families remained wealthy. The social season continued, but the moral foundation had crumbled. Everyone now understood that this luxury was built on exploitation. Everyone knew the human cost. The only question was whether anyone cared enough to change it. The workers returned to their tunnels. They carried their coal. They climbed their stairs. They breathed their dust. But they did so with a different consciousness. They knew what they were worth, and they knew what was being stolen from them. They knew that the system was unjust. This knowledge could not create immediate change, but it could plant seeds that would eventually grow into movements that would transform American labor relations. But that was years away. For now, there was only coal to carry and wages to earn, and the darkness of the tunnels to endure. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. In the aftermath, the world above and below the mansion was forever altered by the hidden cost of its luxury. The decade following the labor conflicts of 1901 brought gradual but irreversible changes to Newport's mansion culture. The changes were not driven by moral awakening among the wealthy. They were driven by technology and economics and the slow erosion of the social order that had made such extreme inequality possible. The first significant shift was mechanical. Central heating systems improved dramatically. Oil furnaces began replacing coal systems. These required less manual labor. A single operator could manage a system that previously needed multiple coal handlers. The tunnels were still used, but less intensively. The workforce shrank through attrition rather than mass firings. Men left for other work and were not replaced. James O'Connor was among those who left. His lungs were destroyed by coal dust. He could no longer handle physical labor. He found work as a watchman at the Newport docks, a position that allowed him to sit for most of his shift. He died in 1908 at age 32. The death certificate listed pneumonia as the cause, with no mention of the years of coal dust inhalation that had destroyed his respiratory system. He left a wife and 2 small children with no savings and no pension. His story was common. Of the 6 men who had formed the core organizing group at the Breakers in 1900, 4 were dead by 1910. Coal-related lung diseases, heart failure from years of extreme physical strain. One died in a construction accident, his weakened body unable to react quickly enough to danger. Only 2 survived past 40. Their bodies were broken, their health destroyed, but they lived to see the system that had consumed them begin to change. The mansions themselves began to decline in the 1910s. The families still visited Newport, but less frequently and for shorter seasons. Marble House was closed for several years. The Elms reduced its staff by half. The Breakers maintained operations, but on a smaller scale. The era of endless expansion was ending. The coal consumption dropped accordingly. By 1915, the Breakers burned less than half the coal it had in 1900. Edward Berwind sold the Elms to a cousin in 1909. He maintained his coal business, but spent less time in Newport. The mansion he had built to showcase his success had become associated with labor problems and negative publicity. He preferred his other properties, where his wealth could be displayed without the taint of controversy. The workers who remained in mansion service found conditions slowly improving, not because of owner generosity, but because labor shortages during World War I gave workers leverage. Wages increased, hours decreased, and basic safety standards became enforceable because the alternative was having no staff at all. The improvements were incremental and came too late for men like James O'Connor, but they came. The coal tunnels gradually fell into disuse. As mechanical systems replaced manual coal transport, the passages were abandoned. They filled with water. Sections collapsed. The mansions that had once depended on these arteries of labor allowed them to deteriorate. By 1920, and many of the tunnel systems were impassable. They became forgotten spaces, their history erased from the official narratives of these grand estates. The cost of the Gilded Age became a subject of historical inquiry and social reform. Writers and journalists documented the excesses and the exploitation. The progressive movement pushed for labor protections and wealth taxation. The unfettered capitalism that had created the Newport mansions faced increasing challenge. The changes were slow and incomplete, but they represented a fundamental shift in American society's relationship with wealth and power. The families who had built these estates began to feel the weight of their legacy. Some donated mansions to preservation societies, unable or unwilling to maintain them as private residences. The breakers became a museum in 1948, open to the public as a historical landmark. Visitors walked through the grand halls, admiring the architecture and luxury. Few ever learned about the tunnels below or the men who had died to maintain the illusion of effortless comfort. What was the true price of such magnificence? The question admits no simple answer. In purely financial terms, the breakers cost $7 million to build and millions more to operate. But the human cost cannot be calculated in dollars. How do you quantify destroyed lungs, broken families, lives cut short by labor that served no purpose beyond maintaining luxury? The accounting is impossible, but necessary. The reckoning came in different forms for different people. For the workers, it came in the form of early death and lifelong disability. For the owners, it came through the gradual realization that their way of life could not be sustained. The social contract that had allowed such extreme inequality was breaking down. The workers would no longer accept invisibility. Society would no longer ignore exploitation. The mansions stood as monuments to an era that was ending. The legacy of the coal era shaped labor movements for decades. The men who had organized in Newport's tunnels inspired others. Their stories were told in union halls and labor newspapers. The incremental improvements they had fought for became foundations for broader reforms. The 8-hour day, workplace safety regulations, workers' compensation for injuries. None of these would have seemed possible to James O'Connor in 1895. By 1930, all were standard, but the cost remained. The men who had paid with their health did not live to see these victories. Their children inherited trauma and poverty instead of progress. The generational impact of the Gilded Age's labor practices rippled through families for decades. The destruction wrought by coal dust and exploitation could not be undone by later reforms. The tunnels that remain today are relics of this history. Some have been sealed for safety. Others are occasionally opened for tours, their stories sanitized for public consumption. The guides speak of architectural ingenuity and the challenges of heating large mansions. They rarely mention the men who breathed coal dust until their lungs failed. They rarely talk about the wages that kept families in perpetual poverty. The history has been made palatable, stripped of its moral weight. Yet the ghosts remain. Not literal ghosts, but the presence of those who suffered. Their names may be forgotten, their stories may be untold, but their labor is embedded in every stone of these mansions. They carried the coal that heated the rooms. They stoked the fires that made luxury possible. They gave their health and their lives so that others could live in comfort. That debt can never be fully paid. It can only be acknowledged and remembered. Chapter 11. The Ghosts That Linger. While the coal dust may have settled, the ghosts of the past refuse to leave the mansion's halls. The Breakers today receives over 400,000 visitors annually. They come to marvel at the architecture, to photograph the ocean views, to imagine themselves in a world of limitless wealth. They walk through rooms that once hosted the most powerful families in America. They admire the craftsmanship, the imported materials, the attention to detail. Yet most leave without ever thinking about the coal. The tour guides mention the heating system in passing. They point out the original furnace room, now a display space showing antique heating equipment. They explain that the mansion burned coal, that servants maintained the fires. But the explanation is brief and sanitized. The physical reality of carrying 150 tons of coal annually through underground tunnels is not conveyed. The human cost is not calculated. The story is told, but the truth is obscured. In the basement of the breakers, portions of the original tunnel system still exist. They are not open to the public. They are not maintained as part of the historical preservation. They are simply there, slowly deteriorating, holding their memories in silence. The walls still bear marks from coal buckets. The floors still show the paths worn by thousands of trips. The architecture of exploitation remains, even as its purpose has been forgotten. Preservation societies face a dilemma when interpreting these spaces. How do you tell a story that makes both the beauty and the brutality visible? How do you honor the architectural achievement while acknowledging the human suffering it required? Most museums choose to emphasize the former and minimize the latter. The result is a sanitized history that celebrates wealth while erasing the workers who made it possible. Some efforts have been made to recover these hidden histories. Your oral history projects have collected testimonies from descendants of mansion workers. Archives have been searched for wage records and employment contracts. Researchers have documented the health impacts of coal dust exposure. But these efforts are limited and underfunded compared to the resources devoted to maintaining the mansions themselves. The stories that emerge from this research are fragmentary but powerful. Thomas Murphy's granddaughter remembers him as a man who could not climb stairs without stopping to catch his breath. She remembers the sound of his coughing, constant and terrible, that dominated her childhood. She remembers her grandmother's bitterness about the family's poverty, despite her grandfather's decades of hard work. These memories are the ghosts that linger. They haunt the descendants as surely as the tunnels haunt the mansions. Giuseppe Moretti returned to Sicily in 1903, his tunnel phobia making continued work impossible. He died there in 1920, never having spoken about his time in Newport. His family only learned about his American experience after his death, when they found papers documenting his employment at the Elms. The trauma he carried was his alone, never shared, never processed. How many other workers bore similar silent burdens? The physical ghosts, if they exist, would not be dramatic apparitions. They would be subtle, the sound of footsteps in sealed tunnels, the smell of coal in rooms that have not burned it for a century, the sensation of being watched in basement corridors. These phenomena are reported occasionally by museum staff and security guards. They are dismissed as imagination or the natural settling of old buildings. But perhaps they represent something else. Perhaps they are the persistence of memory in spaces that witnessed so much suffering. The architectural historian Del Upton has written about how buildings hold memory, not in any mystical sense, but through the physical traces left by use. The worn floorboards, the soot stains that no amount of cleaning can fully remove, the structural modifications made to accommodate changing needs. Buildings are palimpsests, layered texts that reveal history to those who know how to read them. The coal tunnels of Newport's mansions are such texts. They tell a story that the grand halls cannot. They speak of labor and pain and exploitation. They preserve evidence of an economic system built on treating human beings as expendable mechanisms. Reading these spaces requires looking beyond the surface, venturing into the darkness, being willing to confront uncomfortable truths. What do we owe to those who were left behind in the shadows? The question is moral as much as historical. The wealth created by the Gilded Age did not disappear. It was passed down through generations, creating dynasties that still exist today. The poverty experienced by workers like James O'Connor also persisted, trapping their descendants in cycles of disadvantage. The inequality of the past created the inequality of the present. Acknowledgement is a start. Museums and preservation societies are beginning to tell more complete stories. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has launched initiatives to document servant life in historic houses. Tours increasingly include information about working conditions and labor relations. These efforts matter. They restore visibility to those who were deliberately made invisible. But acknowledgement alone is insufficient. The descendants of mansion workers have not received reparations. The families who inherited Gilded Age wealth have not been held accountable for how that wealth was accumulated. The structural inequalities that allowed such extreme exploitation have evolved but not disappeared. The ghosts linger because the injustices they represent have never been fully addressed. In the tunnels beneath the Elms, water drips steadily from cracks in the ceiling. The sound echoes through passages that have not seen workers in over a century. The walls are stained with mineral deposits and mold. The bricks are crumbling. Eventually, these spaces will collapse entirely. When they do, another piece of physical evidence will be lost. The history will become even harder to recover. Time is running out to preserve these stories. The last people who knew mansion workers personally are dying. The physical structures are deteriorating. The documents are fragile and scattered. If we do not act now to collect and preserve this history, it will be lost. The ghosts will have no voice. The suffering will be forgotten. Only the beauty will remain, divorced from the cost that made it possible. The mansions demand that we remember both. The architecture is extraordinary and deserves preservation. But it cannot be celebrated without acknowledging what it required. The luxury was real. So was the exploitation. Both truths must be held simultaneously. That only then can we understand the full legacy of the Gilded Age and avoid repeating its mistakes. Chapter 12. A Legacy Shaped by Shadows. The mansion stands tall, but beneath its foundation, the shadows of the past still whisper of the labor that built its beauty. Bellevue Avenue in Newport today is a tourist destination. The mansions line the street like monuments to American ambition. Tour buses idle outside the breakers. Visitors pose for photographs at the Elms. The preservation societies have done remarkable work maintaining these structures for future generations. But what exactly are we preserving? The conventional answer is architecture. These are masterworks of design, examples of craftsmanship that no longer exists. They showcase an era when cost was no object, when the finest materials and most skilled artisans could be assembled without constraint. This is true and valuable. The buildings deserve preservation on these merits alone. But buildings are not neutral objects. They embody the values and priorities of those who created them. The Newport mansions were designed specifically to celebrate wealth and enforce social hierarchy. The separate staircases for servants were not accidents. The hidden tunnels were not afterthoughts. These features were essential to the mansion's purpose. They allowed the wealthy to enjoy luxury without confronting its cost. They made exploitation invisible. So when we preserve these buildings without fully explaining their function, we risk preserving the values they embodied. We risk suggesting that such extreme inequality was acceptable or even admirable. We turn symbols of exploitation into objects of aspiration. This is not inevitable. We can preserve the architecture while interrogating its meaning. But doing so requires deliberate effort and uncomfortable honesty. The coal tunnels offer a test case. They are historically significant. They reveal how these households actually functioned. They preserve evidence of working conditions that are otherwise difficult to document. Yet most remain sealed and ignored. Opening them to the public would require resources. It would complicate the narrative. It would force visitors to confront the darker side of Gilded Age grandeur. Some preservation societies have begun this work. The Preservation Society of Newport County has developed programs that explore servant life. Yet on tours increasingly include discussions of labor conditions and social inequality. Educational materials provide context that was absent for decades. This represents progress, but the work is incomplete and constantly underfunded. The question of what we owe to the past is ultimately a question about the present and future. We cannot change what happened to James O'Connor or Giuseppe Moretti or the thousands of other workers who were consumed by the coal system. But we can choose how we remember them. We can choose whether their stories are told. We can choose whether the full cost of Gilded Age luxury is acknowledged or erased. This choice matters because the dynamics that created the Newport coal tunnels persist. Wealth inequality today approaches Gilded Age levels. Labor exploitation continues in different forms. The desire to enjoy comfort without confronting its human cost remains powerful. History does not repeat precisely, but patterns recur. Understanding how the coal tunnel system functioned and why it was morally wrong helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time. The legacy of the Gilded Age coal tunnels includes several lessons. First, luxury built on exploitation is inherently unstable. The system required constant effort to maintain invisibility. Once exposed, it could not sustain itself in its original form. Second, workers have power when they recognize their collective value. The organizing efforts of 1900 failed to revolutionize the system, but they demonstrated possibility. Later labor movements built on these foundations. Third, architectural choices are moral choices. The decision to hide the coal tunnels underground reflected values about whose dignity mattered. Those values were wrong then and would be wrong now. What does this story reveal about ambition, luxury, and the price of maintaining them? It reveals that ambition pursued without ethical constraint creates suffering. That luxury enjoyed without acknowledging its cost corrupts both the beneficiaries and the system that provides it. That the price of maintaining extreme wealth includes human lives and can never be fully paid by those who benefit from it. The mansions themselves are monuments to this truth. They stand beautiful and empty, maintained by preservation societies, rather than inhabited by the families who built them, and the wealth that created them was not permanent. The social system that justified them has been dismantled. What remains are structures that testify to both human capability and human cruelty. They show us what we can build. They also show us what we should never build again. The coal tunnels whisper these lessons to anyone willing to descend into the darkness and listen. They speak of men who carried crushing weights, of lungs destroyed by dust, of lives abbreviated by greed, of suffering deliberately hidden from view. These whispers are faint now. Time and deliberate forgetting have weakened them, but they persist. In the end, The legacy of the Gilded Age coal tunnels is a legacy shaped by shadows. The shadows where workers labored. The shadows of history that preservation often casts over uncomfortable truths. The shadows of inequality that persist into our present. These shadows are not separate from the beauty above. They are essential to understanding it. The light of the grand halls was purchased with darkness below. Both must be acknowledged. Both must be remembered. The mansion stands tall. Its marble gleams. Its chandeliers shine. Tourists admire and photograph and move on. But beneath the foundation, in crumbling tunnels filling with water, the shadows whisper still. They tell a story the architecture alone cannot convey. They demand that we remember the full cost of grandeur, and they insist that beauty built on suffering carries a debt that outlasts stone. We are the inheritors of this legacy. We choose whether to perpetuate the erasure or restore the visibility of those who were deliberately hidden. We choose whether to celebrate the mansions without qualification or to hold them as complex monuments to both achievement and injustice. We choose what lessons to draw and what values to carry forward. The coal has long since burned away. The workers are long dead. The system that consumed them has transformed. But the questions remain. What price are we willing to pay for luxury? Whose suffering are we willing to ignore for comfort? What are we building today that future generations will judge as harshly as we now judge the coal tunnels of the Gilded Age? These are not rhetorical questions. They demand answers. The mansion stands tall, but it does not stand alone. It stands on foundations of coal ash and crushed dreams. It stands as testimony to what humans can create and what they can destroy. It stands as a warning and a challenge. The shadows beneath still whisper. The question is whether we are willing to listen.